It was a Tuesday morning in the Manhattan Federal Courthouse when 22-year-old Sarah Martinez entered the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. Accused of international fraud for stealing $3 million from foreign investors, she looked like just another scared young woman facing justice. Judge Robert Anderson, a 50-year-old with 30 years of experience, thought he had seen everything in his career. But when Sarah said firmly, "Your Honor, I speak 10 languages," the courtroom erupted in laughter. Even the judge smiled, thinking it was a desperate last attempt to impress him. What he didn't know was that in the next 30 seconds, this young woman would speak fluently in Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, and Swahili, leaving everyone speechless. Because behind this apparent fraud hid a story of linguistic genius, family sacrifice, and a secret that would completely overturn the trial. The Manhattan Federal Courthouse was packed that Tuesday morning in September. The media had been drawn to the case, a young woman accused of orchestrating one of the most sophisticated international frauds in recent years. Sarah Martinez, 22 years old, a college student with no criminal record, had managed to steal $3 million from investors in 4 different countries through a network of shell companies and multilingual communications. Judge Robert Anderson opened the hearing with the solemnity that characterized his 30 years on the bench. He had seen every type of criminal, but this thin young woman with long dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face intrigued him. The defense attorney, Michael Thompson, was one of New York's most respected criminal lawyers and had taken the case pro bono after meeting Sarah. The prosecutor began by outlining the details of the fraud. Sarah had created 4 different companies in as many countries. One in Germany, specializing in green technology, one in China for import-export, one in Brazil for real estate investments, and one in the UAE for cryptocurrency trading. Through professional websites and perfect communications in local languages, she had convinced wealthy investors to transfer large sums. The peculiarity of the case was precisely this. Every communication was written in the investor's native language, with cultural nuances and specific references that only a native speaker could know. Investigators had initially thought of an international organization, but all leads pointed to this young woman from the Bronx, daughter of a construction worker and a cleaning lady. When Judge Anderson asked Sarah if she wanted to say anything before the interrogation began, she stood up slowly. The silence in the courtroom was total. Everyone expected a confession or an apology. Instead, Sarah pronounced those words that would change everything. The courtroom exploded in general laughter. The audience thought it was a clumsy attempt to impress the judge. Even some lawyers smiled, believing the young woman was desperate. Judge Anderson raised his hand to ask for silence, but he too had an ironic smile. But Sarah began speaking in perfect Mandarin, with a Beijing accent that made the Chinese interpreter in the courtroom's eyes widen. Then she switched to classical Arabic, reciting a verse from the Quran with impeccable pronunciation. She continued in Russian, describing the beauty of Siberian winter with poetic precision. Finally, Swahili, telling an African tale that only someone who had lived in Kenya could know. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Judge Anderson, who thought he had seen everything, was left speechless. In 30 years of legal career, he had never witnessed anything like it. The interpreters present confirmed with nods that the pronunciation and grammar were perfect. Sarah returned to her seat, and for the first time, the judge looked at her not as a simple defendant, but as an enigma to decipher. This young woman was hiding something extraordinary, and now everyone in the courtroom wanted to know what. Judge Anderson suspended the hearing for 10 minutes. He needed to reflect on what he had just heard. In 30 years of legal career, he had learned that behind every case, there were always layers of complexity. But this exceeded all his expectations. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. Journalists were taking frantic notes, lawyers were whispering among themselves, and even the court staff seemed more attentive. The judge decided to immediately investigate the linguistic competencies issue. Sarah began telling her story, one that no one in the courtroom would have expected. She was born to a working-class family in the Bronx. Her father, Carlos, worked construction. Her mother, Elena, cleaned offices. They didn't have money for vacations or private schools, but when Sarah was 5 years old, something extraordinary happened. The family in the apartment next door consisted of political refugees. The father was an Iranian university professor, the mother a Chinese translator with 2 teenage children. When social services needed to find a babysitter for Sarah, that family offered to help for free. What began as simple neighborly help transformed into something incredible. Sarah demonstrated an ease in language learning that her neighbors, both linguists, immediately recognized as extraordinary talent. At 6 years old, she already spoke Persian and Mandarin. At 8, she had added Arabic. The Iranian professor, Dr. Hassan Mostafa, realized he had a linguistic genius before him. He began contacting colleagues worldwide, asking them to help Sarah through video calls and online lessons. The international scientific community was fascinated by this American girl, who absorbed languages like a sponge. At 10 years old, Sarah spoke 8 languages fluently. At 16, she had added 3 more. But her family never knew how to monetize this extraordinary talent. Her parents, though proud, didn't understand the potential of what they considered a hobby. When Sarah started college, studying languages and international communications, she realized for the first time the economic value of her skills. She began working as a freelance translator, then as a consultant for international companies. But everything changed when her father had a serious accident at work. Carlos was paralyzed, and the company, exploiting legal technicalities, managed not to pay compensation. The family suddenly found themselves without income, with enormous medical expenses and no help. It was then that Sarah made the decision that brought her to that defendant's bench. Using her linguistic skills and knowledge of international cultures, she had created those shell companies not to enrich herself, but to raise the money needed to pay for her father's treatment and support the family. She told all this without self-pity, explaining that she wasn't looking for justifications for what she had done. She knew she had committed a crime, but wanted everyone to understand that behind every number in the file was a family that was drowning. Judge Anderson listened in silence, realizing that the case was taking a completely different turn. This wasn't a simple fraud orchestrated by greed, but a daughter's desperate attempt to save her family using the only extraordinary talent she possessed. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, stood up for cross-examination. She had prepared the case for months and didn't want a moving story to compromise the application of justice. However touching Sarah's story might be, the fact remained that she had committed fraud for millions of dollars. She began by asking Sarah to explain exactly how she had orchestrated the frauds. The young woman nodded, knowing this moment would come. With the same clarity with which she had spoken in different languages, she began explaining in detail the mechanism of her operations. She had started by studying the markets of 4 different countries, identifying growth sectors that attracted investors. Then she had created multiple identities, using her linguistic skills to assume different personalities in each country. In Germany, she was Greta Mueller, a renewable energy expert. In China, she was Lin Wei, an import-export specialist. In Brazil, she was Isabella Santos, a real estate consultant. In the UAE, she was Fatima Al-Zahra, a cryptocurrency trader. The genius of the plan lay precisely in her linguistic competence. She didn't just translate texts, but actually thought in each language, grasping cultural nuances. Her emails to German investors were precise and technical. Those to Chinese included appropriate cultural references. Those to Brazilians had the warmth typical of local culture, and those to Arabs respected the complex social etiquettes of the Middle East. She explained that she had used online services to create apparently legitimate documents, studying the specific formats of each country. She had also hacked public databases to obtain information that would make her shell companies credible. The entire operation had required 2 years of 18-hour days, studying every legal and cultural detail. Judge Anderson was beginning to understand the scope of the operation. This wasn't an improvised fraud, but a complex operation requiring extraordinary skills. When he asked if she had accomplices, Sarah confirmed she had worked completely alone. She explained that she had spent months studying international commercial law, offshore taxation, and banking systems. She had frequented online forums of ethical hackers to learn cybersecurity techniques. She had even taken digital marketing courses to create convincing websites. The judge incredulously summarized that she had acquired in 2 years competencies that would normally require multiple degrees and years of professional experience. Sarah confirmed with simple honesty that when you're desperate, you learn quickly. At this point, the defense attorney asked to present new evidence. He had spent weeks investigating the Martinez family and had discovered details that completely changed the case's perspective. He presented medical documentation showing Carlos Martinez's real conditions: complete paralysis, need for constant care, medical expenses amounting to $15,000 a month. He also presented correspondence with the company's insurance, which had refused to pay compensation using a technical clause. The attorney emphasized that Sarah hadn't acted out of personal greed, but had used her extraordinary talent to face a family desperation situation that the legal and insurance system had ignored. Judge Anderson found himself facing a complex moral and legal dilemma. On one side, there was a clear violation of law. On the other, a young woman with extraordinary talents who had acted to save her family from a tragic situation created by system indifference. The real question wasn't whether Sarah was guilty. That was evident. The question was what type of justice was appropriate for such a unique case in Manhattan Federal Court history.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Judge Robert Anderson declared a 2-hour recess to evaluate all the emerged elements. It was no longer just a legal matter, but a case that questioned the boundaries between justice and compassion, between rigid law application and understanding of human circumstances. In his chambers, surrounded by legal codes and jurisprudential precedents, Anderson reflected on a career that had always followed clear principles. But Sarah Martinez challenged all his certainties. He called his clerk and asked to research similar precedents, but the results were scarce. Nothing approached the intellectual and moral complexity of this case. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, Sarah sat silently next to her attorney. For the first time in months, she felt relieved to have told the whole truth. No matter what the sentence would be, at least now everyone knew she wasn't a common criminal driven by greed. Attorney Thompson was receiving calls from around the world. The news of the young woman who spoke 10 languages had circled international media. Prestigious universities were interested in the case, renowned linguists wanted to study her, and even multinational companies had come forward. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere was even more tense. The judge had a serious expression that didn't reveal his intentions. He first addressed the prosecutor for final arguments. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh reiterated the gravity of the committed crimes. $3 million stolen, investors damaged in 4 countries, an international financial system put at risk. However understandable Sarah's motivations might be, the precedent that would be created by absolving crimes for family necessity would be dangerous. The law couldn't make exceptions based on individual talent. Attorney Thompson instead presented a different argument. He emphasized that Sarah had no criminal record, that she had acted under extreme emotional stress, and that her victims were wealthy people who could absorb the losses without devastating consequences. Before the judge wasn't a hardened criminal, but a young woman with extraordinary talents who had made desperate mistakes in extreme circumstances. Condemning her to years in prison would not only destroy a unique talent, but deny society the positive contributions she could make. He proposed an alternative sentence: community service using her linguistic skills to help refugees and immigrants, gradual restitution of stolen amounts through legal work, and probationary supervision for 5 years. The judge addressed Sarah directly, asking what guaranteed she wouldn't use her abilities again for illegal purposes. Sarah answered that she had learned that talent without ethics is destructive. She had hurt innocent people to save her family, and this had taught her that there are no moral shortcuts. She explained that in recent months she had reflected on legal alternatives she could have explored: scholarships for her linguistic skills, work as an interpreter for international organizations, legitimate consulting. All paths that would have required more time but wouldn't have harmed anyone. If given a second chance, she would dedicate her skills to helping people in situations similar to hers, but through completely legal channels. The judge nodded and retired for the final sentence. He faced a decision that would set precedent and be analyzed by courts worldwide. Judge Robert Anderson returned to the courtroom after 3 hours of deliberation. His face revealed nothing, but everyone sensed he was about to pronounce a sentence destined to make history. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Journalists, law students, curious onlookers, and even some fellow judges had come to witness. Sarah sat composed at the defendant's table, hands clasped and gaze fixed on the judge. She had accepted any outcome, but still hoped for a chance at redemption that would allow her to use her talents for good. The judge began reading the sentence with solemn voice. He recapped the facts: international fraud for $3 million, false identities, shell companies, damage to investors in 4 countries, serious crimes that would normally result in severe sentencing. However, he explained, this case presented unique characteristics requiring deep reflection on principles of justice and proportionality of punishment. In 30 years on the bench, he had never encountered a case where such extraordinary intellectual abilities were used in circumstances of such extreme family desperation. He recognized that Sarah had committed serious crimes, but her motivations and abilities required an innovative judicial approach. Justice shouldn't be only punitive, but also reparative and transformative. The sentence was revolutionary. Sarah was found guilty on all counts, but the 5-year prison sentence was suspended and replaced with an alternative measure completely new to the American judicial system. She had to fully repay the stolen amounts through supervised legal work. Her linguistic skills would be put at the service of nonprofit organizations assisting refugees, immigrants, and human trafficking victims. She also had to give lectures at universities on ethics and intellectual responsibility. The most innovative part involved creating a Center for Linguistic and Cultural Mediation that Sarah would have to direct under judicial supervision. The center would provide free translation and cultural mediation services for people in difficulty. The sentence established an important precedent. When exceptional abilities are used for illegal purposes, but motivated by extreme circumstances, justice must seek ways to transform these abilities into positive resources for society. The courtroom exploded in spontaneous applause, quickly silenced by the judge. Sarah cried, but they were tears of gratitude and relief. Attorney Thompson smiled, knowing he had witnessed a historic moment in American law. The judge concluded by addressing Sarah directly. She had demonstrated that exceptional intelligence without ethical guidance can be destructive. Now she had the opportunity to prove that the same abilities, oriented toward the common good, can be an extraordinary force for social justice. Sarah stood and responded with moved voice that she would dedicate every day of her life to proving that this trust had not been misplaced. The Martinez ruling, as it came to be called, was studied in law schools worldwide, creating a new paradigm for handling cases where exceptional genius collided with complex moral circumstances. 6 months after the sentencing, the Center for Linguistic and Cultural Mediation, Bridges of Words, had become a reality exceeding all expectations. Located in a renovated building in Brooklyn, the center welcomed dozens of people daily seeking help to overcome linguistic and cultural barriers. Sarah had transformed her sentence into a life mission. She arrived at the center every morning at 8, coordinating a team of volunteers she had personally trained. She had created mediation programs in 15 different languages, free translation services for legal and medical documents, and cultural integration courses for immigrants. The most touching case was Amira, a Syrian refugee who had arrived in America with her 3 children without speaking a word of English. Sarah had not only helped her with translating documents for asylum status, but had also culturally mediated with social services, explaining Syrian cultural specificities that influenced Amira's educational choices for her children. The center's success had attracted attention from international universities. Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne had invited Sarah to give lectures on ethics of exceptional intelligence and social responsibility of talent. Her conferences were always crowded, not only with law and linguistic students, but also with philosophers and sociologists. During a lecture at Columbia, Sarah explained her transformation. She had learned that talent without moral direction is like a weapon without control. It can create or destroy, help or harm. Her experience had taught her that those with exceptional abilities also have exceptional responsibilities toward society. Judge Anderson closely followed Sarah's progress. Every 3 months, he received detailed reports on the center's activities. The numbers were impressive. Over 1,000 people helped, dozens of cultural disputes resolved, hundreds of documents translated for free, and a 90% integration rate for beneficiaries. But the real success was human. Sarah had found her path, using her extraordinary abilities to build bridges instead of walls, to unite instead of divide. The Martinez family had also benefited. Lectures and international recognition had brought donations allowing better care for Carlos. 1 year after the sentence, the Martinez case had inspired legislative reforms in several countries. The Martinez Doctrine had been adopted by courts in Canada, the UK, and Australia to handle similar cases where exceptional talents were improperly used in personal crisis circumstances. The United Nations had also proposed creating a network of bridge centers modeled on the Brooklyn one to provide linguistic and cultural mediation services in all major world cities. Sarah had been called to New York as a consultant for the project. On the 2nd anniversary of the sentence, the center organized a celebration. Present were all the people Sarah had helped, volunteers, local authorities, and a delegation from NYU studying the model to replicate it in other cities. Sarah spoke before the crowd gathered in the center's courtyard. She spoke in English, but interspersed phrases in the 10 languages she knew, creating a linguistic mosaic that perfectly represented the center's mission. 2 years earlier, she was at a defendant's table, guilty of misusing her talents. Now she was surrounded by people who had allowed her to transform that guilt into a positive force. The center wasn't just her redemption, but proof that justice can be creative and transformative. Judge Anderson, present at the celebration, concluded by explaining that the Martinez case had taught that true justice doesn't stop at condemnation, but always seeks ways to transform pain into hope, error into wisdom, misused talent into social resource. That evening, as the center emptied and Sarah closed the office, she stopped before the large world map in the lobby. Every colored flag represented a country of origin of people who had received help. It was a world in miniature, united by the universal language of human solidarity. The young woman who 2 years earlier had used her languages to deceive now used them to unite. Exceptional talent had found its ethical destination, proving that redemption is always possible when intelligence serves love for others. And as New York fell asleep, in Brooklyn shone a light representing hope for anyone lost between languages and different cultures, knowing there was always someone ready to build a bridge toward home. Like if you believe talent should be used for the common good, Comment which moment in the story struck you most. Share to inspire those who believe in second chances and redemption. Subscribe for more stories of justice, talent, and social transformation. Sometimes the greatest talents are born from the most difficult circumstances. Sometimes those who make mistakes can become those who help the most. And sometimes true justice isn't punishment, but transforming error into opportunity. Because true success isn't measured by what you take, but by what you give to the world.